Welcome to lecture number 9, an introduction to drama and theater. This lecture, like last week's lecture, an introduction to the visual arts, is intended to help you better understand and appreciate the different expressions of human creativity coming out of the cultures and civilizations that we're studying from a historical perspective in the course, and also to be able to better appreciate the expressions of those cultures and civilization using different artistic media about their ideas and feelings about the questions of the great conversation. This lecture, along with the others in the series, will also help you to have ideas and concepts and language to use as you approach your experiencing the Humanities project in the second half of the semester. Now, I'll remind you that in this Introduction to the Humanities course, we take a look at the visual arts, the performing arts, as well as literature. And in today's lecture, we're going to focus on the last two of these three types of artistic expression. You might think that when we're talking about drama and theater, we're actually talking about the exact same thing. But for our purpose, we're going to make a distinction between drama as a form of literature and theater as one of the performing arts. And you'll understand the difference between those a little better as we go along. We look at drama as an example of literature primarily because drama emerged out of poetry. For many centuries, people had been singing songs, telling stories of the great deeds of heroes, or stories about the gods and the goddesses, or expressing their feelings and thoughts about their own human experience. Eventually, as you were reading this week in regard to Greek culture and the beginnings of Greek drama, in different civilizations, these stories began to be acted out. And so drama really represents a type of enacted poetry. So when we're talking about drama, we're focusing on the story elements. How is the story put together? What are the elements and the form of how the story and the events in the story, or the ideas and feelings, how are they being expressed in language? That's the key point about drama. When we talk about the elements of drama, the very first thing that we think about is the form. And if you've read your textbook on the beginnings of Greek drama and watched the lectures that have been presented this week, you know that the two primary forms of Greek drama that emerged were tragedy and comedy. And these have really been the foundational forms of drama in the West, at least in Europe. Tragedy being the form of drama that it includes sadness, but it's primarily more about a great fall and a change of fortune. Someone who experiences conflict and goes from a position of greatness and power and life working really, really well to a position of suffering where they have lost many things. For instance, in the great example of Oedipus the king, he goes from being a great heroic figure, well thought of, and the king of his city, to being a blind beggar, cursed and wandering in the world. The philosopher Aristotle said that tragedy should create in those who watch it feelings of pity and fear as they reflect on, through watching the events of the story of the characters, they reflect on their own human situation, their own human lives. By contrast, comedy was a form that just turned things upside down and took what was inappropriate and lowly and poorly thought of in society generally and put it into a place of just ridiculous favor, ridiculous power, and just things that were absurd and out of the ordinary that would cause laughter or embarrassment, often through obscene aspects of costume or what was portrayed on the stage, or through language, or through things that were very suggestive from a sexual standpoint. And so these two forms, tragedy and comedy, have always been kind of the distinction in European, Western drama. But in other cultures, there are different perspectives, different approaches at telling stories and enacting stories. And so, as we move into some of the other cultures and civilizations that we'll look at, you'll encounter different ways of presenting stories on the stage. For instance, a little bit later in the semester, we'll have the opportunity to look at a form of Japanese drama known as Noh, spelled Noh. And as we move into more modern times of the 1600s, 1700s in Europe, we'll begin to look at changes in how stories were written and presented in drama, becoming a little bit more realistic until we get to the very realistic forms of drama that we're accustomed to today. Now, when we are talking about plot in drama, we're talking about, obviously, what happens in the story. And a significant part of plot is the action. And we talk about action in drama or any kind of a story in literature as beginning with, usually there's some setting of the stage or setting of just kind of the backstory. The development of things. And then action begins to rise. And by what we mean is that the level of tension begins to rise as the conflict that drives the story begins to get a little bit more intense and a little bit more intense and a little bit more intense. And the action continues to rise until it reaches a turning point where something has to happen. The breaking point is referred to as the climax. And that when something happens that changes everything, then gradually the tension begins to reduce a little bit. We call that falling action until it reaches toward the end of the story, a French term called the denouement, which basically means kind of wrapping things up and tying up loose ends, maybe, and finishing up the story a little bit. Now, in the last slide, I mentioned the word conflict. All tragedy and most good stories involve a conflict. Someone who is trying to accomplish something and is being prevented from accomplishing that by someone or something. And when we are talking about conflict in drama, the person who is trying to accomplish a goal, who's trying to achieve something or solve a problem, is known as the protagonist. And the person or thing, it might be not a person, but it could be possibly an animal, a monster, or even natural forces. It could be fate, it could be God. But the person or thing which is preventing and acting against the protagonist is called the antagonist. Another element of the plot in drama would involve symbol or symbolism. And symbolism is when the writer of a play, of a tragedy, or even a comedy makes use of an object or an action to communicate a larger idea or to indicate something larger than just itself, or communicate in a visible form something very, very important for the overall meaning of the story. A great example of this comes from another of the Greek tragedies written by one of the playwrights, Aeschylus, who wrote a story called the Agamemnon. Agamemnon, if you've read the section from the Iliad in this week's assignment, you know that Agamemnon was one of the leaders of the Greek army at Troy, and that the play that Aeschylus wrote actually tells the story of Agamemnon's homecoming after the Trojan War, after the city's been destroyed, and after Agamemnon returns in triumph with all of the booty that he has taken, including a very attractive young woman that he brings home to his wife and household, but that gets very, very complicated. Anyway, as Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, welcomes him home, she literally rolls out the red carpet, and a long red cloth is written right into the story, right into the written script of the play. That it is unfurled and it billows and waves in front of Agamemnon. This very red carpet on which he comes in and enters into the household. Now, that is a powerful symbol in this play, as the audience would know, because in the myth, in the story of the Trojan War, one of the things that happened before the Greeks could sail off to conquer Troy was that the gods were preventing the Greek fleet from being able to sail away. The winds were against them, and the gods demanded a sacrifice to make them happy, to appease them, and so that they would release the Greeks to be able to go to Troy. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter, his young daughter, put her on the altar and literally sacrificed her, according to the story. Clytemnestra never forgave him. And so when she welcomes him home with this bloody red carpet, it is a powerful symbol of what had taken place in the story. It's not portrayed in the play, but the audience, because they know the myth, they know the story, they would see that object, that rug or carpet, and it would remind them of the terrible cost of the Greeks going to conquer Troy. It's also a symbol to move the audience forward in the story because, as everyone would know as well, Clytemnestra in the play murders Agamemnon and the young Trojan princess that he has brought home. And so there's bloodshed involved before, during, and after this play. And Aeschylus uses a powerful visible symbol to communicate those ideas. Another element of the plot in drama, especially in Greek drama, but in many other forms of drama as well, is irony. And for our purposes, irony means when someone does something or says something that means exactly the opposite of what it is that they say, and they don't realize it, or they may not realize it, or there's a situation in which things appear to be one way, but they're actually completely the other way. For example, in the Greek tragedy Oedipus the King, Oedipus, one of his great strengths and one of the things for which he is very famous, and actually how he ended up becoming king of the city of Thebes, is his ability to solve riddles and figure things out. And that's kind of a theme that runs throughout this play. But the problem is that during the course of the play, Oedipus doesn't realize that he is part of the very problem he's trying to solve, in that it is because he unknowingly killed his father and actually ended up unknowingly marrying his mother and having children by her, and that's a real mess. Anyway, all through the play, Oedipus is talking about how he will find the person who's responsible for the curse upon the city and drive them out. And meanwhile, while he is saying all these things about figuring out the puzzle and punishing the wrongdoer, the audience, again, because they know the story, because they know the myth, are just squirming in their seats as he says things that are obviously just, so almost painful to watch, because he's pronouncing a curse upon himself. And so irony has been used often in both in tragedy and comedy as a powerful tool that a writer uses to communicate with and produce powerful emotion in his or her audience. Now, besides plot, or what happens in a play, in a drama, we also think about character. And character means, how are the individuals who are presented in the drama, the men and women who populate the story. How are they presented? Playwrights have many different ways that they can present even the same character in different stories. For example, there were a number of Greek playwrights who wrote plays about many of the same kinds of stories. They would write stories about Oedipus, they would write stories about Odysseus or Ulysses, about Hercules, about Agamemnon, about many of the same characters or individuals. And yet, they would present them in different ways. Sometimes the figure of Oedipus would be heroic and great and tragic, but tragically flawed. At other times, in a different treatment, a playwright might create an Oedipus who is not so honest, not so admirable, and so a playwright, person creating a drama, always has a choice in terms of how he or later she might present the individuals. And so, an interesting thing to look at is to delve into what are the motivations that are given to the people who are part of the drama. Why do they do what they do? How are they presented in terms of personality? Are they good? Are they evil? Are they a mixture of those things? Are they obviously strong? Are they weak? Or are they a mixture of those things? And so that's what we mean when we look at character. Not only who is in the story, but how they are presented. If plot has to do with what happens in a story, and character has to do with who is in the story, setting is the where the story takes place. A playwright has a choice, usually, as to where he or she can place a story. And very often, the setting becomes an important element not only in the story itself, what happens, but the meaning of the story. For example, the modern American playwright Eugene O'Neill wrote a very famous play called Desire Under the Elms. And the setting of the story, written right into the script of the drama, describes this house in New England on a farm with very hard, rocky, stony soil, and that on either side of this house, this solid, old, dilapidated house, are two gigantic elm trees that reach up and stretch over the house. And that's where the play gets its name from, Desire Under the Elms. And the elm trees that are part of the setting, and the rocky New England farm and the stone fences are all part of the world in which this drama has been placed. And this world shapes the characters, and the world shapes the kind of action that can happen between these particular characters, and the story of desire and love and betrayal that all happens within this world in which the elms hover over everything that takes place. The elms themselves, going back to symbolize a powerful presence, a person who never appears in the play, but the story is constantly influenced and determined by the influence of this particular person and the physical world of the elms and those kinds of things. So setting is very, very important to pay attention to in drama. When we're talking about subject and theme, you might, again, think that we're talking about the same thing. But there is a difference between subject and theme. Subject is what the story is about, the immediate events, the obvious things in the story. For example, William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet. The subject matter is a love story between a young Italian man and a young Italian girl, teenagers essentially. And so the subject matter is love. But throughout the story, there are underlying ideas, underlying concepts that inform and shape how the plot unfolds and what William Shakespeare is trying to communicate to his audience. And these underlying ideas are known as theme. Now, the theme could be closely aligned with the subject matter. For instance, romantic love and sacrifice would be a theme related to the subject matter of a love affair. But because the young man and the young woman are from families that have this long ongoing blood feud, an underlying theme is also grudge and revenge and hatred. That's not what the play is about. The play is about the two main characters and their love for each other and how they come together and tragically what happens to them. But the theme is how one theme is how the desire for revenge and the holding of grudges and blood oaths, how they can destroy those who hold them. And that was a very important theme in the historical period in which William Shakespeare was writing, because that kind of stuff happened all the time, not only between individuals, but between families, between nations. It determined a great deal of what unfolded in his society. And William Shakespeare is making some statements by addressing these themes using the subject matter of the drama. So, as you're watching a drama, a comedy or tragedy or whatever form, you want to think about the underlying ideas that you can sense are part of what's being talked about. Up to now, everything that we have been talking about has to do with the telling of the story and how a playwright has used language to tell the story and to fill his or her story with ideas and meaning through form and plot and action and setting and character and all those kinds of things. Now we're going to move from the story as it was written by the playwright to the enactment of that story as it's actually put on stage. So our focus moves from the playwright, the creator of the script, so to speak, to the director or the person who is in charge of how the story actually gets put on and staged. And so we're now moving from literature and drama to the performing arts and theater. And so we're looking at some different elements. The very first element has to do with function. As you learned in reading about Greek drama, sometimes theater has a civic or even a religious function in the society. A civic function would be to present the story of the history of a city or of a country in a very positive light and to celebrate the achievement of the great national heroes or civic heroes. That would be a function of a play. Or, as in Greek tragedy, they told the stories that were related to the god Dionysus. The Greek tragedy and comedy actually were performed at religious festivals honoring the god Dionysus in the city of Athens. And so there was a religious function. In the Middle Ages, as we'll come to find out later in the semester, sometimes stories from the Bible or stories of great saints of the past were put on by traveling groups of actors in order to stimulate the faith of people who could not read the Bible for themselves, but by viewing the stories on the stage, it inspired them toward devotion to God. Again, that's a function of theater. Sometimes theater has a political function, as a playwright and a director create a play and stage a play in such a way that they want to point out something that's wrong in the society in which they live. They want to make a statement about the ruling authorities, a king or a queen or a president or a parliament or Congress, and that happens very frequently. Many people believe that William Shakespeare's plays are full of political statements in the way that he wrote the plays, but William Shakespeare was also an actor and a director. He not only created plays, but he staged them in his own theater called the Globe Theater in London, and sometimes he even performed in them. And so sometimes plays can have that function. Now the script we've covered pretty well. Script for theater is all the stuff we've been talking about in terms of the literary aspects of drama. So we're not going to go back over those, but we want to pay especially attention when we're thinking at from the performing side of theater to the subject matter and themes that are covered. Another aspect of theater is staging. How is the play, how is what the playwright wrote actually enacted? What kind of stage is it on? There are different kinds of stages. You go to some theaters and you would sit in the audience, and the audience is all around the stage. Stage is in the middle of the theater, and there are people on all different sides. That's called theater in the round. Another type of theater is what we are most familiar with, is a theater in which the audience sits kind of out in a big room, and the main action takes place on an elevated stage that kind of thrusts out into the audience a little bit, or has a flat surface. That's called a proscenium stage. Some theaters have that kind of stage that you're most familiar with, but it literally thrusts out into the audience. The audience isn't on all sides of it, but the audience can see maybe three sides from three different points of view. So how it is staged. Sometimes you'll go to a play and there'll be action taking place in front of you, and then all of a sudden you hear somebody behind you, and some of the action is taking place behind you. That's a decision that a director has made in terms of how he or she wants to put the story on. Another element of staging or performance would be the costume. What's very, very interesting are sometimes directors make choices to take plays that were written in one historical period. For example, a play written by William Shakespeare in the 15 and 1600s, but a director makes a choice to dress the actors in very contemporary, modern style clothing, which kind of plays with your mind. And maybe to even have them speak in old style English of the time of William Shakespeare, but they're dressed in clothing like you and I would wear on the street to class or in our homes, or perhaps in military uniforms that more reflect contemporary society. Again, that's a decision that a director makes. Question is, why would a director make that kind of decision? What is he or she trying to do, trying to communicate? Another element of that would be scenery. Scenery obviously has to do with, what's in the background. Is the stage pretty much empty and bare, or is it very kind of stylized? Is all the scenery painted and obviously flat and two-dimensional? Or is it very three-dimensional? Is it very lively? Is it very abstract? Is it primarily just wood and canvas, or do the things seem like really, really solid? The Broadway play Les Miserables, which is very famous from the movie of the last few years ago, when it was staged on with very elaborate kind of scenery and things that moved in and moved out right in the middle of scenes and were raised and lowered and all those kinds of things. So why does a director make those kinds of choices in producing his or her play? Another element of theater has to do with sound. When you are putting on a play to an audience and there are spoken lines, it's nice if the audience can hear and understand what those lines are. That creates some interesting difficulties. If you watched the videos on Greek tragedy this week and read in the textbook, you learned that Greek theaters from the early beginnings developed specifically along the lines in how they were constructed in hillsides to create an environment in which thousands and thousands of people could sit in these outdoor theaters and with no form of artificial or technical amplification, no sound systems, only the kind of amplification that the costumes and the masks that they wore provided. People in the farthest back rows, thousands of people in the farthest back rows, could hear the actors speaking even at just a regular loudness, the way that I'm speaking, narrating this lecture. And so the issue of sound so that the audience can hear the words, because remember, it's not just the action, it's the words in a play that carry much of the meaning. But it's not just the words. Action is also a key. So how is the action portrayed? There are sometimes you go to a play, a drama, where people, they don't do any acting at all. They stand in front of you. They might be in costume. There might be scenery in the background. They stand there. They have a book or a folder in hand, and they read the script. That's a type of theater called reader's theater, where there is no actual action taking place. All the way to some forms of theater where almost no words are spoken and it's constant action. How realistically, if there are scenes of conflict, either between two individuals or between a large group of individuals. For instance, if you are watching a play in which part of the story involves a great battle that took place in history involving thousands and thousands and thousands of people, how do you portray that on a stage in an enclosed space? That's a question that directors and producers struggle with and have to figure out an answer for. So how do they do that? How is the action portrayed? How does the action become a part of what the overall play communicates? I love this part of the lecture because when you open the slide and you see opera, I know that for some of you, right about now, you're heading for the nearest door or the window, just trying to run out of the room. But hang in there. Opera is a particular type of theater, and really all that it is opera is a form of theater that combines action with sung words. Rather than spoken word, there is sung word. I mentioned the movie and the stage show Les Miserables, which is actually a modern form of an opera. If you notice in the movie, if you've ever seen it on the stage, there are no spoken words in this entire show that was performed for many years on Broadway and other places around the world. It's an opera. All of the communication happens through singing. And so in watching or viewing an opera, you think about things like the musical form. When you think of opera, maybe you think of a woman standing in a big helmet with horns, with a high-pitched voice and singing like this. Things aren't over until the fat lady sings. That was a type of opera that was popular from the 1500s through the early 1800s in Europe, and those type of operas are still being written today in many different kinds of languages: Spanish, Italian, French, even English, telling great heroic stories of the past. And opera is still performed in places like New York and Los Angeles and even Lexington and Louisville and other cities in Kentucky. But that's only one type of musical form where opera. Back in the 1960s and early 1970s, there was an opera called Tommy, which was actually a rock opera, and all of the story was told again in song. If you've ever heard the song Pinball Wizard, that The Who first performed, and then Elton John performed it in the 70s, that is one of the songs out of that rock opera. So very, very, that's a very different form of music than what you might automatically think of when you come to opera. And again, when we leave European culture and go to Africa or Asia or the Americas, you'll have different musical forms that are part of opera. In opera, again, you'll want to think about staging, costume and scenery, action, subject and theme. We're not going to go into all of those things. One of the main things, though, to remember about opera, opera is different than musical theater, and that's a key difference that I want you to grasp. Opera, everything is sung. That's what makes it an opera. Musical theater is a play, a tragedy or a comedy in which most of the lines are spoken with songs interspersed throughout. So, shows like Cats, shows like Miss Saigon, shows like Sound of Music, shows like Carousel and Oklahoma, and some of the even Grease, if you're familiar with either the stage show or the movies. Those are musical theater or just musicals. Those are different than opera. As we wrap up this introduction to drama and theater, we can't really go away from this without talking about how cinema, film, and video are related to drama and theater. Obviously, these two forms of performing arts are related to drama and theater in that they are enacted action. They are enacted poetry or stories that make use of technology, different types of technology. So, just as you can talk about elements of the script with a stage play, you can talk about the writing of a film. There are some films that are just tremendous in how they're staged and the action that takes place and all those other kinds of things. But they still have a script. They still have a story. Sometimes the script is really powerful and strong. Sometimes it's just really awful. And it's legitimate to pay attention to the writing in a film, in a television program, as much as you do in the other forms of theater. Likewise, there is set and location. Now, the difference is you'll notice not only set, meaning setting, but location. One of the advantages of using technology, film, or a video base is the ability to present stories outside, outdoors, and to use natural settings. If you've watched the Lord of the Rings movies, the original Lord of the Rings movies, not the more recent Hobbit series, those were filmed in New Zealand. And the incredible scenery that becomes an important element of the story was scouted out by Peter Jackson, the director, and the folks working with him. And they use these sweeping landscapes just to give you a sense of the power of the story that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote in his original books. And again, in cinema, you can talk about the action. Is it stylized? Is it realistic? Does the action slow down at all or speed up? Obviously, you can talk about costuming. Something that we did not talk about, we could have talked about lighting with theater, but we're talking about it here, is how is light used? How bright are the scenes? How is darkness used as an important element of visually communicating the story? Once again, there's the issue of sound, but with film and television, video, obviously sound is recorded, and there's the opportunity to introduce sound effects that aren't really present but are used to enhance the viewer's experience. There's also the opportunity to use music and incorporate music with the spoken lines and the scenes that take place. How does music get used in the telling of this particular story? Cinema, either film or video, are shot with cameras. Directors use cameras, either digital or using film or tape. How does the director choose to move from scene to scene? How does the director choose to follow action? One of the developments in more recent years is the use of what's called shaky camera technique, where as you're watching action unfold, the cameraman, shakes as like he or she is running alongside to give you, the viewer, a sense of being right in there with the action. The director doesn't have to choose to do that. There are ways to keep the camera absolutely still. So if in the finished product that you see in the theater or on your television set includes kind of shaking camera, you have to ask yourself, Why did the director choose to do it that way when he or she could have done something else? Ties in a little bit to editing. Obviously, when you film a story for television or for film, cinema, um, it is a series of scenes that are shot individually and then edited together. How does the director edit? Do the scenes kind of ram into each other? Is there a fade gradually out of one scene into another? Are there points at which a director chooses to keep the camera focused on a particular individual or a particular scene? Does the director use a lot of close up? Does the director use a lot of backing the camera away? Does the director pan the camera to move and sweep it across so that you get a sense of largeness? Um, all of those kinds of things have to do with both camera technique and editing. Well, hopefully by now you've gotten a sense of all of the many different kinds of things to pay attention to when you watch something performed on stage, or when you read a play as part of an assignment for a class or just for your own enjoyment, or as you listen as well as watch what you watch in the theater or at the movies or on your own television. To think about how all of these literary and performing elements come together in what we enjoy as drama and theater. Um, in our next lecture, we'll take a look at another one of the performing arts, but for right now, we'll say goodbye.